Hello, this is Paul Lucas for Jumpstart Nature Photography, and welcome back. This segment, we're going to be covering creative use of light, part 2, exposure. So in this segment, we're going to delve back a little bit back into the craft of photography and talk about our camera and using and creating exposures and the correct exposure, just briefly to kind of remind you a little bit about the use of light and how it relates to the craft of your photography. As always, in my introduction, you can see my work at paullucasphotography.com, the URL there listed. I'd be happy to speak at your local organization for no charge to give a Jumpstart Nature Photography presentation. I'm available for hire for classes and workshops. And if you'd like a copy of any of these presentations or have any questions, drop me an email at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography, all one word, .com, paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. And I'd like to encourage you to consider submitting photographs for a positive and constructive critique of your work. No charge for that. You can see some of the details here on this slide. If you have any questions or are interested in participating, again, drop me an email at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. So as you remember, we've covered the first two goals of this course outline: the craft of photography and the art of photography, the ideas of composition, right? And now we're talking, finally finishing up the last part, which is composition related, called the creative use of light. So part 2, creative use of light, part 2, exposure. So exposure is the amount of light reaching the camera, sensor, or film. And remember, we control that through two different means, and we'll talk about those coming up, primarily two different means. And our best image requires our compositional skills, our subject knowledge, our exposure skills, and our technical knowledge. So some of these are the art side of photography, and some of these are craft side of photography. And remember, ultimately, exposure, getting a good or correct, or the exposure you want to use to express your vision in the photograph is your responsibility. Camera meters have gotten very, very smart, but they're not perfect. They look to meter for the mid-tone exposure in the photograph, and that's why we recognize or recommend using matrix metering. We'll talk about that in a moment. Camera metering is very good, but it can be fooled. So don't let your camera make all your decisions for you. Your camera is a tool. Remember, the photographer is the most important part. You make the creative images. So as we've talked about, there's a variety of modes in your camera. There's manual, where you set everything: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. If we set it to auto ISO, primarily we're working with shutter speed or aperture. There's aperture priority, which is what I recommend at the beginning for landscape and nature photography, or nature and landscape photography, where we set the aperture, and with a fixed ISO setting, the camera chooses the shutter speed. And then there's shutter priority, where we choose the shutter speed, and with a fixed ISO, the camera changes the aperture opening. And again, traditionally, for most of our work in nature and landscape photography, the aperture, controlling the depth of focus or depth of field, is the most important thing. So shutter priority, and then finally the picture mode. It does everything automagically. So I would recommend shooting in aperture priority or manual mode. So remember, we talked about the exposure triangle in depth quite a bit at the beginning of the craft of photography set of presentations. And just as a reminder, right, the three parts of the triangle are not necessarily in any particular order: shutter speed, which we measure in fractions of seconds; aperture, which we discuss in f-stops, which are the ratio of the opening of the lens to the focal length of the lens; and then we also talk about the sensitivity or ISO setting for our camera. And those three things together create a good or correct exposure. So remember, as I kind of said in the other slide there, the correct combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO will give us the correct or good exposure. And remember, we focus on aperture in landscape and nature photography. If we change one part of the triangle, it may require us to look at and make adjustments in the way it affects the other part of the triangle. So remember, I said an aperture priority with a fixed ISO, primarily we're going to be letting the camera choose the shutter speed, and then we'll examine the shutter speed to see if it meets our requirements for a good photograph, and then adjust the ISO setting typically as needed. We talked about reciprocal values in a whole separate presentation. This means the amount of, when we change one part of the triangle, how do we make sure the same amount of light the camera sees is reaching the sensor? So, for example, here's just some reciprocal ratios. We're starting always of a base of f8, 1/30th of a second, and an ISO 100. And say we decide we want to do selective focus. So we're going to open our aperture wider. We're going to go to f4. And how does that affect our exposure triangle? If we're in aperture priority mode, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. We're going 2 stops, 5/6, from f8 to 5/6 to 4. That's 2 stops. So our shutter speed will change by 2 stops, 1/60th to 1/120th at a fixed ISO. Conversely, if we're starting out on f8, 1/30th, f8 for the aperture, 1/30th of a second for the shutter speed, and ISO 100, and we want to get a greater depth of field for our particular nature scene, and we change our aperture opening to f11, so we're going up 1 stop, or we're changing the amount of light going through the sensor by 1 stop less, we have to increase the amount of time by 1 stop that light is falling on the lens. So that's going from 1/30th of a second to 1/15th of a second. So just to go back to the first example for a second, by opening the aperture by 2 stops, we're allowing more light in. If we didn't change the shutter speed, we would overexpose the picture. So we have to, while we're opening the diameter of the lens to let more light fall through to the sensor, we have to narrow the amount of time that the shutter exposes that light to the sensor by f8 to f5/6 to f4 by 2 stops. So we're shortening the time it's open. In our last example, we're shooting f8, 1/30th of a second, ISO 100. It's a very, very windy day. So we know, or it's a windy day, and our trees are moving around, and we want to try and freeze that scene. And we've determined probably 1/250th of a second would be just right. So how many stops are we narrowing the time or reducing the amount of time light is exposed, right? So we're saying we're going to keep the same opening, but the shutter is going to be open for a much shorter time. So we're going to have less light hitting the sensor. So we're going from 1/30th to 1/60th, 1/125th to 50th, 3 stops. So we're going to have 3 stops. So how do we compensate for that? We want f8. That's our aperture opening. So in this case, to increase the shutter speed, we can increase the ISO by 3 stops, making our sensor more sensitive to light falling on it. We're amplifying that signal is what we're actually doing. So to go 3 stops, more sensitivity, we go 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800. That's 3 stops. So remember, we reduce the number of stops of the time that light's falling on the sensor and the shutter speed by 3 stops. So we have to increase the sensitivity of the sensor by 3 stops if we don't want to change our aperture opening. Okay. Again, these are in whole stops. Cameras work in 1/3 and 1/2 stops. I like to think in whole stops when I'm just kind of mentally thinking about how I want to change my camera settings to the scene. If we're in aperture priority mode, primarily we only have to worry about the change in the shutter speed, and we can adjust or compensate that through the ISO setting. And again, you can use 1/3 and 1/2 settings. I think the default for most cameras is 1/3. You can use that adjustment, increasing the ISO sensitivity to reach 1/250th if it gets there faster than the whole stops. But it's just easier for me to mentally think about what I need to do, what I want to do, and then do it in whole stops. If you're in manual mode again, you would be setting f8, 1/250th of a second, and then within your camera there would show a meter whether you're over or underexposed, and then you would adjust the ISO accordingly. Okay, just some reciprocals. Good thing to keep in mind. Don't necessarily have to memorize it on day one, but do spend some time thinking about it and how it affects your exposure. In camera metering, we recommend for landscape and nature photography using a metering that covers most of the frame. So there's a kind of metering that looks at the entire scene or a majority of the scene and determines what a correct or good exposure is. In Canon, that's called evaluative metering, so you'd set your camera for that. In Nikon, it's matrix metering, and in Sony, it's multi-metering. These meters are designed to meter at what we call 18% gray or neutral gray. This came about many, many years ago by physicists creating and chemists creating chemicals and film and everything to do that, and looking at the kinds of information coming into cameras to go on the film. So white and blacks can become gray without your help. So if we have a scene with a lot of snow, it's going to try, the snow is very bright, right? It's several stops, 4 stops over middle gray, and it's going to try, or 2 stops, it's going to try and make that sort of that middle gray tone. So if we're shooting with a lot of snow, we might have to override the exposure by 2 stops. So changing the shutter speed or ISO setting perhaps by 2 stops to make that snow look whiter. So we can add 2 stops. So as I mentioned, getting started, use evaluative matrix metering, aperture priority mode. Try different exposures, experiment. Use exposure bracketing or exposure compensation, or change the ISO to see what happens if you over or underexpose your images. So exposure compensation is another way to change the settings. This will change the shutter speed without having to change the ISO setting. And so sometimes this is often useful when you've created a scene that you're exposing for, and we want to add, we look at our exposure, we look at our histogram. We'll talk about that in an upcoming presentation because that gives us some guidance in getting a good exposure. And we want to capture more data in that scene. So we might use exposure compensation. It's another setting on your camera. I'd encourage you to look at your manual to change the scene by adding or decreasing the stops through the exposure compensation. And really what's it essentially doing at a fixed ISO, it's changing your shutter speed. So I'll probably do a little separate short presentation on exposure compensation in the future because that's very useful. So for now, when you go out in the field, just to add to your confusion, this is the end, yes. To add to your confusion, I'll back up. Let's go out in our field and start out with matrix metering or evaluative or multi aperture priority mode. If we set up our scene, set up our f-stop for our aperture, look at the shutter speed. If we need to add more time or decrease the amount of time the shutter's open, actually, it's a higher number, but it's a fraction of a number, right? Then let's use the ISO setting for now to change that shutter speed. And then in the future, we'll talk about using exposure compensation. And this is the end. That's the end of this part 2 presentation exposure. And I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for viewing this.